So thank you for coming out on perhaps the coldest day of the year, and certainly the coldest day in South Carolina since I've been here. And this is not really what I bargained for. Coming from a tropical place to the south, I thought it was going to be a little bit mild, but I will say that I am probably much better off than our guest Ashley Burns, who is coming from Massachusetts, where I believe you said it was 10 degrees or something?
Negative 10.
Negative 10 degrees this morning, so I'll take what I can get. So this is our fourth presentation, our fourth speaker in our series. So I hope you can help me welcome Dr. Ashley Burns, who is an assistant professor at Amherst College in Massachusetts. She got her PhD in public policy from the Duke Sanford School, which has a great program in public policy, as well as a master's degree in public policy from there as well. She has a BA in political economy, I think, from Williams. Also even colder than Amherst, so she's working her way south. She does a lot of work on affordable housing, and today she's going to talk about some things that come out of her dissertation and her current work, that is a book manuscript that she's working on related to, broadly speaking, housing as a concept and housing as a value in the United States. Her work, it sounds like, focuses on poverty and race and inequality with spatial components, which is something that I think is certainly pertinent to the theme of this speaker series, which is really about how do planners and policymakers deal with majority-minority communities, and part of that is about inequality and spatial inequality in particular. So she'll make a presentation for about 50 minutes, and then we'll have the rest of the time for discussion as usual. So I hope you help me welcome Ashley Burns.
Thank you. And if you have questions, I'll take questions during the presentation. Before I start, though, it would be helpful to have a sense of who's in the room, because I don't want to bore you by spending too much time covering background. Are you familiar generally with the Hope 6 program? Yes, no, maybe? Some people? Okay. So I want to make sure that I'm speaking in a way where everyone's on the same page. So the talk that I'm going to give today is called Stuck on the American Dream, Examining the Future of Affordable Housing. But we're actually going to examine the future of affordable housing through the lens of Hope 6 policy. I'm not making the argument, but I generally do make the argument that I think that Hope 6 policy, the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program, Choice Neighborhoods, that pretty much the policy perspectives that we offer right now at the federal, city, and state level are pretty much the biggest drivers we have to creating actual affordable housing, that you don't see much affordable housing being developed outside of these initiatives. And so I'm going to talk about these initiatives specifically. So just to start out, I'm going to show you a couple of images of public housing and also what affordable housing looked like in the U.S. Prior to public housing as we know it. I think that oftentimes when we talk about the dilapidated conditions in public housing in the U.S. in the 70s and 80s, we forget what housing looked like in this country prior to that program. So even though many people think of public housing as a huge failure, when we first introduced public housing into this country, it was considered a really, really good thing. It was about driving an economy after the Depression. It was about housing a submerged middle class. It was about providing a stable lifestyle for white working class communities. And we kind of conflate what we think of kind of 1990s, 1980s public housing with the whole public housing program as a whole and think of it as a failure. But for much of its life, most people would make the argument that public housing was a rampant success at its origin. So this picture is a very generic picture. This is Hooverville of the Great Depression era. So I think it's really easy for us to forget what housing looked like in America before we had what we currently have. This is a picture of San Antonio, Texas during the Great Depression, Camden, New Jersey, Los Angeles, California. And so I'm showing you a bunch of different cities to kind of make the case that geographically, housing was in pretty bad shape in this country prior to the federal program to build more affordable housing. New York City, this is the inside of a slum in New York City. The Queensbridge Public Housing Development, which is the largest one built. This is a public housing development in New Orleans, Louisiana. And so the reason I want to think about affordable housing as an important issue to address is that in my own research, I see race as being something that's very salient and at the heart of affordable housing policy at the heart of both the successes and the failures that these programs face. This picture here says we want white tenants in our white community. Another historical feature that a lot of people forget is that public housing at its origin was segregated by race, right? And so much of the public housing that was first constructed were constructed for white families in neighborhoods that were already predominantly white, and that there are lots of cases of actual activism for black communities to fight, to advocate to get affordable housing built in their neighborhoods. So we often think of public housing as a place for black welfare queen, mothers with children, Harlem, New York, right, Atlanta. But this is not what public housing was in its origin at all. So this is what public housing looks like currently after Hope 6. And again, I'm going to show you some images of places across the country. So this is Washington, D.C. This is Columbus, Ohio, and Louisville, Kentucky, Pennsylvania. The three pictures are Atlanta, San Francisco, Houston. And so one of the things that I found really interesting is how did we get to a world where public housing went from looking the way it did before to looking like this? And in what world did we decide that this is what affordable housing should look like? So just from the crowd, do you think that this is a better form of affordable housing than what we had before? And I think that that's a big thing that we all agree on. However, one of the tensions that I face in my own work is that while it's important that public housing be aesthetically pleasing and that we kind of create communities that are more viable or maybe offer more geography of opportunity, we still are demolishing our old public housing in a world where there's a lot of homelessness and there's a lot of need for any type of housing beyond our paternalistic ability to say that someone's housing is inadequate. Right. I'll be doing a lot of walking back and forth because I don't have a clicker. So just to give you the motivation behind this project, I call it New Communities in Old Spaces. One of my colleagues writes that Hope 6 housing is about separating, dispersing, assimilating, and re-socializing the poor. So the problem that we mostly saw in public housing at the end of the 1980s and the 1990s was that there was persistent deprivation in public housing. That there was little socioeconomic diversity, there was concentrated poverty, there was social isolation of the poor, disinvestment in poor communities, and so on. So we had a very, very big narrative about why we needed to fix public housing. We had decided as a nation that it was broken. And the solution to that would be to manufacture socially mixed communities in place of public housing. And this is kind of where I entered with my own research when I was a graduate student. So I'm from New Orleans originally, where there's been so much controversy about tearing down public housing. People marching down to you can go on YouTube and type in like public housing New Orleans, and you'll see people marching down to City Hall and demanding that their neighborhoods be preserved and not be torn down. You saw tasers, the cops were on horses. They locked the city council meeting where they were going to vote on making these decisions. And from the community-based perspective, people thought that this was a really bad thing. People thought that you're coming in and you're tearing down my neighborhood and this is where I live. But what was difficult for me is at the time I was working at the Charlotte Housing Authority, and then there was a very different perspective from the side of practitioners. The practitioners that I worked with, I felt very strongly and passionately believed that they wanted to deliver a better product to people who needed an affordable, safe, decent place to live. They thought that children should live in neighborhoods that were more socioeconomically diverse, that had less crime, that had better schools, that had more resources, that had what I call a better political economy of place. And I really couldn't understand that tension. How is it that the people who are working so hard to better this community feel so out of sync with the people who they're serving? And that was the conundrum that I faced. And if I hadn't worked at the Housing Authority prior to starting my PhD program, I don't even think that my research was going in this direction. Before this, I was really interested in property rights and land use and completely other things. But this issue of, how do we decide to fix a community and use their feedback to fix it in light of the fact that you may be fighting against a community that they don't want your help, right? That's what I was trying to figure out. Oh, and it works. So the motivation for this project, so the work I'm presenting to you today is qualitative. So we'll spend some time reading some quotes. It's not going to be regression kung fu on the screen today. But everyone says it seems really different from what it was. This was coming from someone who lived in the neighborhood. And when I show you those images, obviously, aesthetically, the neighborhoods are very different from what they were. But then again, there's a tension on the ground. So you go to some of these communities, and people who live in these areas for a long time, they say that it's still the ghetto, it's still the hood, it's just pretty. You still have the same poor people. They're not getting better opportunity. You're not seeing actual growth in the family, social mobility trajectory, but they're prettier and we're giving people a better place to live. But then there's some people who say, oh my gosh, this community is so different. It's gentrified. They've pushed everyone out. Everyone who used to live here, they've been displaced. And so again, how is there this tension? How are there some people who say the community is exactly what it was, but then there's others who are complaining about how the community has been reformed by the government? So why mixed income living? And I'm sorry that I try not to put too much text on the screen. There'll be a lot of text when we get to the quotes though. So the assumption here is that there should be benefits to residents that accrue from the incorporation of higher SES members into revitalized former public housing community. So everything about how we decided to fix public housing, even if not explicitly stated, was really riding on this assumption that, oh, you know, we need to bring some more affluent people in, that if we just take poor people and put them closer to non-poor people, we can fix everything like magic. And that's kind of the sociological rhetoric around why you should do mixed income housing. I think the more fiscal rhetoric is that it's more economically sound to do mixed income housing, right? We're in a world where in the economy that we live in today, it's not really viable to build a development that's all ACC units, that's all public housing units, right? Because we can't fund that, and there are questions about the financial sustainability for those projects over time. Whereas if you do mixed income development from a financial perspective, you have more sources of financing, you have more variety of levels of what your rents are coming in, so your operation costs are a little more solvent, right? And so I think there's a disconnect again between kind of the rhetoric about why you do mixed income housing and the reason that we actually are doing mixed income housing. And if you have questions, I'll take questions as I'm talking, if I'm going in one direction that you're unfamiliar with. So the outcomes then, if we move more affluent people in with poor folks, should be improved social networks, more desirable social control, more desirable behavior and cultural norms, and improved political economy of place. And so in the academic world, people focus so much on the social networks, the social control, and the culture and the behavior aspects of these communities that it's really easy to forget that all we were trying to do in the first place was to improve political economy of place, right? So the whole impetus behind fixing public housing was saying that we're having a neighborhood that's just fostering a lack of social mobility, and we need to put some infrastructures in place that are going to correct for that. But instead, once we started doing Hope 6, we turned to the rhetoric. We turned about bettering people's lives and making them role models and teaching them to value work and improving their culture and culture of poverty and all this pathological stuff that we really didn't have much evidence for, but I would argue were more central drivers for all of the Hope 6 development that you saw more than anything else. So the study setting here is in Durham, North Carolina. For the purposes of the presentation, it's going to say Southern City. But the picture on the left is a neighborhood called Few Gardens. Few Gardens was the first public housing built in North Carolina. It was for white working class mill workers. Over time, it became 99.9% African American and low income, but that wasn't the origin of this community. So the picture here on the other side is demolition day. So this community got a Hope 6 grant to demolish their neighborhood, and this woman is digging up her plant. The other really interesting thing that I found when I went to do this project is that for Durham, North Carolina, almost every single African American person that I talked to when I did my pilot study at some point had lived in this community. So that's another aspect about public housing when we talk about generational poverty, of thinking about how for some people it can also be a generational step to some mobility that maybe we miss in the data. So this is what this neighborhood looks like now. So it's mixed income, there's scattered site housing, so there's housing on the original footprint of the public housing development, and there's also housing kind of pocketed around the downtown Durham area. And so I think that you were nodding before, we agree that this is a better environment. However, when you go in and you talk to residents, it is very clear that there isn't much more going on than a better environment. That people definitely make the argument that they feel safer, that they have better quality units, they have bigger units, they have more modern units, but you're not seeing big gains in income, we're not seeing big gains in education, and other kind of socioeconomic factors that you would track. All you're really seeing is people saying that they're having more psychological and emotional kind of gains from living in a safer community. So the pseudonyms here are going to be Murphy Manor, which is going to be the apartment complex that I'm talking to you about, and New Village is going to be the home ownership development. So one thing about Hope 6 as well is a lot of these communities usually have a home ownership development that goes in conjunction with the rental component. And so for this talk today, I'm actually going to focus on the homeowners. So oftentimes we spend a lot of time talking about the renters, and the homeowners are kind of understudied in these developments. But I think the homeowners are a really important population because they really transform what we think of when we think of serving people with public housing, when we think about social spending on poverty communities, impoverished communities as well. And so they're these indirect beneficiaries to federal funds, right? And it's a population that we weren't necessarily serving before through this program. So Durham, I would say, is a post-industrial southern city. The public housing that I'm talking about, it was built in the 1952 genre. It's a smaller site. And so I thought that it was a more feasible project. So a lot of public housing developments are large in some cities, but the typical ones are not. And so what I thought was really interesting about this neighborhood is I thought I could own it, right? It was small enough that I could go in and feel like I understood the place and feel like I understood the residents, as opposed to kind of embarking upon a larger scale site. So the case here is just this one public housing development. It's close to downtown. It's close to Duke University and North Carolina Central University. And so they put the new mixed income units on site, and they also put single family homes on the same street of it. So why talk about homeowners? Like I said, they're indirect beneficiaries of Hope 6 policy, that they're the new models for community, right? So the whole point of giving them these neighborhoods is because they're supposed to model for impoverished families how to become more affluent over time. And also their characteristics of home buyers, we know little about them, right? People aren't really studying who's moving into former public housing neighborhoods, right? Who's gentrifying these neighborhoods? And a question that I want you to keep in the back of your mind is it gentrification if you just have marginally more affluent African Americans moving into an African American community? What do we call gentrification in 2015, right? Because the technical notion is this idea that you're going to have kind of hipsters moving in, white hipsters moving into neighborhoods that were typically not that way before. But I would argue that Hope 6 really challenges how we think about gentrification, because at least in the South, places like Nashville, Birmingham, New Orleans, Charlotte, in many cases, you just have more minorities moving into a neighborhood that was already predominantly minority, and their profile is different. They tend to be college students. They tend to not have children. They tend to be unmarried, smaller households. But from an income perspective, they're not necessarily more affluent money-wise than the people who are already living there. They just have more middle-class values as far as their profile because of their education, right, and their trajectory. Does that make sense? So to tell you a little bit about this sample, they're very diverse in occupation. They're all working for the most part in low to moderate income, these homeowners. There's minimal racial diversity, but it's relatively less homogeneous. So if this neighborhood was all black before, it's still mostly black, but now there's some white households in a neighborhood that previously had no white families. That they have a lot more social capital, and we'll talk a lot about that. Many of them are single or childless, or they have adult children. Most of them are first-time home buyers, and many of them are newcomers to this neighborhood, and they have a lot of political capital. So this is who's gentrifying poor public housing communities in Durham, North Carolina. So the three themes that I'm going to talk about today is othering, policing and regulating of social space, and the maintenance of rules of engagement and interaction. And so the reason I'm going to switch to this qualitative lens to tell you what life is like in these communities is I really want you to think about what sustainability looks like and what the goals for affordable housing should be in 2015. When we build affordable housing, is it the simple goal of just providing affordable housing at a level that people can afford? Or do we want to go back to some of this rhetoric about improving social mobility, about the children, about bettering neighborhoods, about sustainability in the long term? And I would say that it's important to go back and identify what the goals are, because in many ways some of those goals are incompatible with one another. So the social construction of other. So what was really interesting to me is when I started out this project, I thought that I was just studying the former Few Gardens, this neighborhood that I'm not from, but I'm going to go and be an ethnographer and study this community. What I learned really quickly is that it was two communities within one. So unlike kind of what you read in the academic literature, I found no evidence that any of the people who were renting knew any of the people who were owning homes, and vice versa. So I thought that on the surface it seemed like one neighborhood, but on the ground it was two neighborhoods that were completely distinct, which was ironic to me because they are on the same street. Like they're physically, these are the homeowners and you guys are the renters. And so you see social distancing, application of stereotypes, classing, and distrust. So I'm going to do a little bit of crowd participation to keep you, it's really cold in here, so if I don't, you'll fall asleep. So we have two quotes here from Gary and Jonathan, and if you could just read the red text, that way we don't have to read all of the text, that would be really helpful. So I'm going to just call on people from the audience. So could you read Gary's text?
The hope of gentrification, there is an impression those units are going to draw bad elements. I really don't know any of those people.
And so what you find from Gary, so Gary's a Caucasian male, he's married, he was divorced before that, he doesn't have any children, and he bought a home in this neighborhood because he was hoping that it would gentrify. So he had a very limited budget because he was coming out of a divorce, and he bought in this neighborhood on the hope that it would become more white and more affluent over time. And so he's really just sitting on his hands waiting to see if the neighborhood's going to turn all the way over. What's really important, though, is when he talks about the sense of community, he's always willing to explicitly say, I don't know any of the renters, I don't know any of those poor folks. On the other hand, Jonathan, and for Jonathan, could someone read the whole quote, including the blue? Thank you.
It's uncomfortable for me, the way they talk about Murphy Manor residents. This fear of us versus them feels a lot. Murphy Manor is them. Call me a hippie, but they are not bad people. It's a lot of people. We know what it means to struggle. I would say 90% of those people who live in New Village are low income. I think it's all psychological. It's not rational. Now, one hilarious thing, we're so concerned with Murphy Manor when the homeless shelter is right there. We don't care about that. You would think they would be more of a threat.
And so starting out the study, so these quotes from Gary and Jonathan are from the pilot study of this project. And so I immediately didn't know what to do with this information in a way. So one of the things about this neighborhood is this is a black neighborhood, and most of my respondents are black. And a lot of the literature that we have about affordable housing, we don't have a lot of neighborhoods that are mixed income and African American, right? And so a lot of what we find, a lot of the tension that we see, we attribute it to racial tension. We say, oh, well, you know, it's just whites animus against blacks. But in my neighborhood, it's a unique case because my homeowners tend to be African American, where in your typical study, you are going to have that difference where race is heavily correlated with who's renting and who's owning. But that doesn't really explain what I'm finding. And so what you're going to see in these quotes is I have a very, very strong class narrative that you don't get when you study your typical neighborhood, because your typical neighborhood is not going to be showing so many different classes of people who are the same race. And so that's when the project morphed a lot for me, because I didn't really know how to explain some of my findings. This other aspect that Jonathan's talking about is something that's also really important to Hope 6 that no one else is really talking about as well. Like I said, from an income perspective, there's not much difference between my homeowners and my renters. So what it shows me is that you could do an experiment that says, okay, everyone needs affordable housing, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to give these folks over here a house, and I'm going to give you guys an apartment. So in some cases, the mortgages don't differ from the market rate rents, is what I'm getting at here. And in some cases, the incomes of my homeowners don't differ as much from some of the incomes of my renters. But you find that over time, people will then perform class, even if it isn't as rigid as a metric, right? So if I give them homes and I give you apartments and we wait 2 years, you're going to act as if there are very, very salient differences among you. And I didn't expect to find that. The home ownership components of Hope 6 tend to be very heavily subsidized. Usually you can get a grant for your down payment and other sources of money to buy homes in these neighborhoods. And this is the idea that if we don't incentivize people to move into Hope 6 neighborhoods, they won't. The people who are able to buy a home, why would they go buy a home in a risky neighborhood instead of somewhere that's more stable? And so we give a lot of soft money to people to buy homes in these neighborhoods, such that over time what you find is, again, like I said, they make $25,000 a year, you guys are making $23,000 a year, but they got a home and a mortgage and you got rent. And there's a way that then we perform class based on these notions of citizenship and what we're consuming for our housing product that I just did not expect, and I had never read that in a textbook setting even. So Dominique and Curtis are also talking about classing and application of stereotypes. Jim, can you read Dominique's quote? Red and blue. We'll do red and blue for a while, and then when you start fading, we'll just go to the red.
I noticed some of my neighbors' attitudes are kind of like, oh, they're low income, they turn their nose up and expect the worst of the people across the street. That's how they see them, the people across the street. My neighbors would be mad at me that I'm sticking up for the people in Murphy Manor.
And then could you read Curtis's quote, please?
People in that type of environment, in and out, anyway. I mean, it's like people who live in the problem. All their life, or been around people in the projects all their life. They have a mentality. It's a bad mentality. They have half the people, they don't work or on fixed income, and that's all they know. If people don't have the power to buy homes, they know the government is taking care of them. No matter what you do, how you try to restructure their lives, that's what we're gonna have now. That's what we have now.
And so again, this is another issue about assumptions of building affordable housing. Did we ever stop to think about what it would mean to do a model, I don't know, let's say like the Netherlands, where we do social housing that's at different levels of income, but maybe no one's an owner or maybe no one's a renter, and how that might change some of the patterns or some of the pathology that we associate with certain neighborhoods, as well as community sustainability over time, if we change that form of who's invested in how, right? So again, the reason I'm giving you this angle on the project is I'm telling you all the things that I didn't expect to find, but I find them really intriguing, and I also find that many of these things are not explained by the literature that we currently have. The other thing that we'll talk about is policing and regulating of social space. There's an over-reporting of crime and hyper-policing, a conflation of crime and social behavior, as well as an overzealous concern for bad parenting in this community as well. Oh, I think I turned it off. Oh. So Jonathan and Gary first tell me about over-reporting of crime and hyper-policing. Jonathan says, whenever I hear gunshots, even if it's just every other month, I call into 911 because that's how they plot. And so he explains to me very sophisticatedly, right, that he knows that the more they report their crime, the better police coverage they'll have. And so again, that interacts with notions of how safe and perceptions of criminality and victimhood in this community. So they're over-reporting their crime on purpose. And then Gary says, we are well aware that Southern City on the police side dedicated resources to this area. We're right in the middle. We paid overtime to police officers. We let them dress in plain clothes. There's even a house on the street where there's a police car that sits in front of a home as a decoy. It's not even someone's police car, but they park it in their neighborhood because they think that it would deter crime. And so then Gary says, we're still aware that there's criminal activity occurring. Oftentimes it's very out in your face, very out in the open, but when you look at crime statistics for this neighborhood, you can't find much evidence of crime on the record in the books at all. And so then I probe the residents about crime, and you find that it's not actual crime, but there are certain behaviors that people conflate with crime that then they're reporting to the police, and so it's perpetuating the notion that the neighborhood is still unsafe, but there's no evidence that the neighborhood is physically actually unsafe. And so Rosalind and Dominique explained to us what crime actually looks like in this neighborhood. Can someone read Rosalind's quote? Can you read Rosalind's quote then?
Basically, I see a lot of the same things happening over there as in other public housing. I see a lot of sitting out. I see boyfriends moved in. The crime rate right now it's not that bad yet, so that's because it's relatively new. I see children, unsupervised children, all over the neighborhood. I think right now, I think basically it's too early to tell.
And then Dominique says, but mostly they complain about the children. I never see these kids doing anything wrong. I only see them playing. I mean, they're children. There are a lot of them. But a lot of the time, the neighbors complain about the children in general, but they're just kids. They think the kids are going to do something wrong. And so the reason this also has very strong implications for the future of affordable housing is, remember, the reason that we started tearing down public housing in the first place have to do with some of these same narratives about what a good neighborhood looks like. And so part of the concern here is that if we're spending all this money building affordable housing communities, but we're going to just let ourselves be relieved to the same notion in 10 years that these are still bad neighborhoods, and will we be in this cycle of just kind of tearing things down and reproducing something over and over again, when what we really have issues with are the people we're serving rather than the communities that we're building. The last theme is maintenance of rules of engagement and interaction. These quotes are about screening and exclusion of tenants and the preferences for how people think these communities should be allowed to have people access them, formalized communities, and issues of paternalism. So Samantha and Jonathan talk about what they think should be done as far as repopulating these communities after the Hope 6 grants and the monies are spent and the units are up for rent. Can someone read Samantha's quote? Can I get you to read Samantha's quote for me? Thanks. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Make sure they screen people that come in there. Make sure that people are qualified to come in there. Do some testing, do some background checks, so they won't get bad people over there. Everybody over there is not bad people, but you get a lot of mess.
And then, because I pointed to you, can you give Jonathan's second quote, please?
We created this us against them mentality with our wrought iron gates, beautiful sign with our fencing. There was an idea to request that we become a gated community with only key code access. It's annoying to me, because that's not how you stabilize a community. By having an enclave of special people, we want the rest of you out. It just invites more crime. They're not family or our community. It's kind of like telling them you don't belong here.
So part of the reason, again, that this is extremely problematic is the only reason we subsidize homeowners to live in this neighborhood in the first place is that they were supposed to be the ones creating the inviting, stable community, right, that would sustain the funds that we've spent to rehabilitate the public housing neighborhood in the first place. And then finally, Curtis and Sheila. Curtis says, we try to establish relations with them by having a Halloween party or an annual back-to-school party. We enjoy it. We invite the mayor. He came, city officials mostly. And so the reason that I'm also showing these quotes is there's no actual informal interaction. The interactions that the homeowners talk about, they're very kind of performed notions of getting to know each other. So there'll be a block party and they'll invite the mayor. Or they'll invite city officials who then come because obviously they care about the voting block that they're also supporting in this community. But there's not any kind of natural ways in which people describe having friendships or alliances in these communities. And again, the reason I say that that's important to know is that if you think about the model, right, the way we were supposed to get to the outcomes had to do with these mediators and moderators that had to do with interacting with folks. And so none of that interaction is occurring. So can we get the outcomes that we were anticipating in the first place? And then finally, Sheila says that we in the Housing Authority have tried to develop programs for the kids. And mind you, they don't have kids, but they're going to develop programs for those kids because those kids need help across the street. To give them another outlook, they're not taking advantage of them. We don't have many kids over here, but it starts, kids mimic what they see. If all they see is a life of crime and violence, then nobody is ever too old to be saved. We need to target the environment in their homes. And so these are the themes of formalized community and paternalism. Another issue that's at hand in many of the Hope 6 communities is that we offer homeowners associations to the homeowners, but many of the residents do not have resident associations, and so they don't have a way to mobilize themselves politically, even against some of these initiatives that the homeowners are putting in place. So remember what we were supposed to be getting were these more desirable behavior and cultural norms and improved political economy of place. I would argue that you definitely see these in Hope 6 communities, that there are definitely improvements in perceived lifestyle of the communities. There's gains in diversity, even if they're marginal. There's very little evidence of patterns of role modeling and very fragmented gains in any social efficacy. And the social efficacy I do see improving has to do more with the homeowners than the residents who are actually under the poverty line. That there's improved political economy of place because you're seeing more goods and services. You are seeing businesses starting to develop in this neighborhood where they were not there before, and that there's also access to high quality home ownerships, right? These are green star homes that people are getting for a really cheap price just because they're in an impoverished neighborhood or a neighborhood that was once impoverished. And so the average price of the homes sold in this neighborhood range from about $92,000 to about $120,000 in sales price. And so that's why I said in many cases the mortgages mirror some of the rents in that neighborhood. Improved social networks, we just simply don't get that. Desirable social control, you definitely get that. And so the community has more perceived stability and voice over time. But the reason I think that these issues are important and that we still have to talk about them is that they have very grave implications for what the future of affordable housing may be. There's a lot of money being funneled into this form of fixing poor neighborhoods. And I make the argument that I'm not sure how much policymakers are thinking about the big picture in some of the frameworks that are being used to develop these models. And so I think a concern would be, like I said before, in 10 years, will we see ourselves revisiting these Hope 6 communities and thinking that there needs to be reform all over again? Because I think that what people won't say is I think that they are taking issue with the population being served as opposed to some larger kind of macroeconomic goal of fixing affordable housing in this neighborhood. remember, again, I said that the main issue as well is that we need affordable housing in this country, but we're tearing down pretty stable, good quality public housing, and that's debatable, but I would say sound, architecturally good housing if the alternative is homelessness, right? We're demolishing that when there's so few people who are even accessing the public housing that we had in the first place.
The housing that we're currently demolishing, is there a relationship between the nicer affordable housing and the not nice looking affordable housing in terms of crime? Like, is there less crime in the better maintained affordable housing?
So there's less crime in the newer public housing, but part of it has to do with the demographic, right? So by definition, most of the new affordable housing can only at most be 30% ACC units. And so when I say ACC units, I mean like basic public housing. And so by definition, you have fewer people. And so in some cases, it feels like there's less crime because there's literally fewer people, right? And so I had 1,200 units, but I only built back 600. And out of that 600, only 200 of them are even targeted to lower income communities. And so in some cases, you see less crime there just because they're fewer, it's less dense. But I think that many would make the argument that in some ways, some of the crime you see gets simply displaced to other parts of town. That one is not as conclusive because there's some cities where people have been able to demonstrate that, hey, we've simply moved the crime from this neighborhood to this other housing project. And then there's some studies that find that you can't actually prove that statistically, that there's more crime. So does that answer your question? So issues about sustainability, understanding beneficiaries and what it means to be helping the poor. What are the goals of building mixed income affordable housing? And I say that because, again, we're not building much affordable housing outside of the mixed income model. What does it mean to do regulation and control in these communities? And this kind of spoken question about the intersectionality of race, class, and gender. So I didn't talk much about gender, but the other caveat is that most of the people in this study were women. They were female-headed households. And so these are some of the themes that don't come up, but I think are going to have really direct implications for how we do affordable housing. So let's see how much time we have left. So that was exactly 40 minutes. And so I gave you a lot of information, and so I thought that it made sense to just leave some time for you to steer the conversation on some of the themes that you want to focus on more. So again, this is Murphy Manor in New Village, and so I'm going to open it up for questions. I can click back to other slides. We can elaborate on certain things. But what are some of your thoughts on this? Do you think that there are other models of affordable housing besides mixed income that could still be viable today?
Well, how does this compare to the voucher program and how that's working? Do you have any insight into that?
And so I think it's so different from housing vouchers. And so the direct way that they're related is that when we first put in place a Hope 6 initiative, and we're talking a lot about Hope 6, but there's ways that Choice Neighborhoods and the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program are still going to model Hope 6, even though Hope 6 is now no longer funded the way it was. But when we tear down the public housing, families get a voucher, and they can then take their voucher into the market. And so in many ways, Hope 6 has flooded more housing vouchers in many cities. So for instance, in Atlanta, they've torn down most of their public housing and moved to a voucher model where they believe that the way to serve affordable housing is through vouchers and choice, right? Kind of the way we talk about charter schools and stuff. And so I think that they're really different things because the cities where you see a lot of housing vouchers tend to be cities that are more welcome to, housing people with housing vouchers. And so again, what that means is then you see a lot of the times people are clustering with their vouchers. And so it's almost a difference of having public housing that the government owns the building versus public housing where the government isn't owning the building, they're privately owned, but you're still kind of serving the same population in the same way. So can you elaborate on your question?
Evidence about things like not being in a high poverty neighborhood anymore, or mentoring, or role models, or whatever, among people who move? I mean, I think I read evidence recently that said it's hard to find evidence that the voucher people are doing better economically, but they do like having the vouchers and say they prefer the neighborhood they're in to the neighborhood they used to live in.
So people like vouchers. The families who tend to move with vouchers through Hope 6, they do report more safety. So there's some psychological and emotional benefits. That's the only real finding we get out of looking at the moving to opportunity and control programs that are kind of precursors to this. But there are not many other findings beyond that for for many of the mothers, they feel safer and therefore they're healthier because they have like less depression and less anxiety. There's some findings that show negative outcomes for males, getting in trouble in school, and I think issues of how crime is perceived in different neighborhoods that are not necessarily the setting where a lot of these families are coming from. But that being said, one of the things that's also true about voucher families is that they tend to be better off. And so when you have a housing choice voucher, you pay about 30% of your income in rent. And so what that means is that the families who use housing choice vouchers, they tend to be a little bit better off than public housing families, many of which are paying $50 a month for rent, which is the basic minimum in many public housing communities. And so for housing choice voucher families, I think the real issue with going to a voucher model of affordable housing is that you have your voucher forever, but when you lose it, you tend to lose it forever. And so for families with vouchers, they have to pay utility bills, and in most public housing, you don't. And so that's what most families report as a deep hardship, that transitioning to having to pay a light bill or a water bill can be very, very difficult financially for many families to muster. And so if your lights or if your utilities get cut off for longer than X number of days, you will get evicted. And once you're evicted, you lose that voucher forever. And so my concerns for the Atlanta model have more to do with real sustainability, that if we give more vouchers but then people lose those vouchers, then we're not really serving more people with affordable housing because they have no alternative once they lose it, because we've torn down the public housing that would have been their housing of last resort.
I have one more question. Did you talk to many children and find out what their attitudes are? Because I would think that one comment that could be made about your research is like, well, these are adults and their habits are ingrained and they've just moved into this development. Let's see what happens to the next generation of people who grow up in this development, which is where we would expect to find evidence that role modeling helps or whatever. So do you have thoughts on that?
So for IRB, I didn't get to talk to children. I have some subjects who are 17 and 18 years old. I think that even they don't report any interaction with the more affluent tenants. They tend to still kind of, we talk a lot about, like, you know, who do you hang out with and friends and interactions, and if you babysit for anyone or do favors for neighbors, and, you know, issues of neighboring. And the kids don't express any benefit as well beyond feeling safer. So that is the one thing I do find, is that everyone reports feeling safer, and everyone reports that there's more aesthetically pleasing kind of traits to the neighborhood. And so that's why I think that question about what do we want when we build affordable housing, it's really unanswered. Like, do we want to say that we need to build these communities that, you know, provide social mobility and move people closer to the American dream, or do we just want to say we're a country where there is a lot of poverty and there's a lot of homelessness, and we need to fix that problem, that, you know, there's literally a market failure where we're not serving these people and the government needs to step in? Or is it about these kind of more fluffy, holistic, unstated goals and assumptions that we're using to drive how we actually deliver these programs? Yes.
I know that there's an economy of scale issue, and I certainly think that's a factor in what's creating and sort of continuing to concentrate the poverty. But I'm sort of curious about this concept of dispersing people, and not on a voucher structure. I know that the city of Berkeley was actually taking units and, you know, buying up properties throughout parts of Berkeley, just individual houses within areas that were relatively more affluent, and then putting people in, you know, like taking down affordable housing and putting individual families into these different units. So effectively dispersing these neighborhoods so that people were suddenly within another whole income group, and they were the only impoverished relatively in the neighborhood. But I'm wondering, and it has worked to some extent in terms of sort of changing people's lifestyles and expectations and access to resources and schools and everything that you were trying to create with that voucher structure. And I'm wondering, have you examined anything related to that? Because it seems to me the problem that you're presenting here is really the continued concentration of poverty, right?
Yes, and I think that what's really interesting about that angle is like not even economies of scale, but also just the difference in geography. So being able to get a program like that being tenable politically, it's also kind of a self-selection, right? So you're able to do mobility programs in communities that are willing to receive them. And so again, that's why I think that that case for spending a little more time looking at the model of the South and the history of the South and segregation and the culture of Southern communities, I think it would be really insightful to help us know how could we better deliver affordable housing, because NIMBYism is real in the South, and you're not really you're not going to be able to get a successful mobility program on the ground. And then the examples that we do have, people don't fare as well because they don't integrate and they don't really assimilate into the communities. And so in the research that I've seen, oftentimes families don't last long term. They end up returning to a neighborhood where the demographic profile of the census tract maybe looks more like where they were before, or in many cases in the South with the vouchers, they're not actually able to access census tracts that look very different from where they started. And so I think that that's a really amazing point, but I do wonder, how do we get something like that to go forth in these areas? Yeah. Yeah.
The Berkeley Hills community didn't really want to accept some of the people.
Yeah, and I think that, to be really frank, that's what I struggle with the most. When you do qualitative work and you're talking to people, it really challenges all of the kind of textbook notions that you have. I think that when I started this project, I really thought that if I encouraged families to get their GEDs and to go to community college and to pick up a trade or a skill, that this would really be the key to social mobility. And you learn very quickly that many families are facing multiple constraints and multiple signs of deprivation that aren't going to necessarily be magically fixed. And so when you're sitting with a woman who's 63 on SSI taking care of 3 of her grandkids, who has a bad back for being a nurse's aide and underpaid for many years, and when she got hurt, received no pension and nothing for the fact that her disability now is related to the work she did, and for me to tell her to get a job at Walmart so that she could lose her food stamps but have $15 more a month but need childcare for those grandkids that she's taking care of, you start to run out of policy solutions really quickly when you try to apply the textbook to people. I can't even give you many examples where I interviewed someone where I walked away knowing how to fix their situation. And I think that that's the conversation that we're not having about affordable housing in this country. We're not willing to accept that there is a very distinct and real part of our population, as diverse as it may be, that are going to need housing and cannot afford market rents in the economy that we're giving, right? In a place like New Orleans, right, you have situations where rent has tripled in many places since Katrina, but wages have not, right? New Orleans is a place where a studio apartment, I think the fair market rent may have been around $400 before Katrina. Now fair market rent on a studio is closer to $700, but wages obviously have not. I mean, if we were seeing that kind of growth in wages, we'd all be better off, right? And so we're not willing to talk about this macro picture that why don't we just provide affordable housing because we're gonna need it. Because there's people who are never going to be homeowners, who are never going to move out of this social economic class, and that even if they do, there are going to be 10 more families lined up to take that slot. And those are the conversations that we don't have, and I think that muddle this notion about what we're trying to accomplish. And then I think the other point that you raised that I've been struggling with more recently in the poverty seminar that I teach is this issue about relative and absolute poverty. Is it better to grow up in the Ozarks in a community where you're really embedded and you have networks and you have ways to survive and thrive in your own manner? Or do we take those children and put them in a new environment where they're relatively much, much, much worse off? And I actually don't have the answer to that question, because you can argue for days in both directions about the benefits of moving children into an environment that is more elitist or has a better geography of opportunity. But this question about, is it a rat race? Does everyone need to buy a home and own a home versus whatever people want to do to thrive in their own way is something that's really untouched. And I don't know that answer to that question of if it's better to be in a community where relatively everyone is like you than to juxtapose oneself into a community where, you're really, really poor among really, really affluent people, and what that means to someone's trajectory overall. Uh-huh.
Yeah, I had 2 questions. The first one is just, I wondered if you could say a little bit more. You sort of suggested that there was a great deal of similarity between the owners and the renters because of the prevalence of programs that help the owners actually get the down payment, which would be the biggest difference. But the one, I guess, first is, are they really exactly the same? Because my sense is that even if there's those grants, there's going to be things like credit score checks and all these other things, that there might be a meaningful difference between those two. And then the second is, it seems kind of possible that by concentrating on the very lowest income segment of this, we're also ignoring a really important constituency, which is that next one up, and especially in the South, where you have such a recent and strong history of racial segregation and homeownership and discrimination. Is that, are we basically are we also not only underserving these ones on the very bottom, but underserving this whole population that's ready to maybe own a home, although a very affordable one, and sort of forcing them back into the public housing model, and then when they very understandably distance themselves based on, things that we would all be uncomfortable talking about, but sort of in some sense, say, you're classist, and that doesn't seem very fair either. So I guess.
So there's a lot there. So first of all, there's a smokescreen in the sense that when we talk about public housing in the U.S., we're really talking about kind of a threshold for annual income that's anywhere from about $7,000 to $12,000 a year in annual income. So we're talking about people that are well below the poverty line for household size in many cases. And so there's all this hoopla about mixed income housing, but we do not really discuss what mixed income housing means. And so in these neighborhoods, what I find is that when I say marginal, I mean that it's mixed income housing. Is it that that you should be mixing a couple of $9,000 a year households with a couple of $11,000 a year households with a couple of $16,000? Like, what are the thresholds that make a neighborhood truly a mixed income community? And that dialogue isn't as part of the story. And so that's why I think the homeowners are really important in the sense that I do see them as a big beneficiary of this program, because all of them, I would say all of them in my study would not be able to access homeownership outside of this situation. Will that home ownership necessarily equate to like huge gains in wealth? That we don't know, right? We don't know what's going to happen to these homes in these neighborhoods, because what we don't see is that these Hope 6 developments do tend to be an oasis in the desert, right? They do still seem to be proximate to other neighborhoods that are privately owned, but aren't necessarily the best neighborhoods as well when we think about notions of what's a good neighborhood. And so I think that you're right, that there's a lot at play in figuring out who's benefiting and what parts of the model are actually efficient and effective that should be replicated elsewhere. And so I think that you're right in the sense that I think that one success is that we do a good job of housing people who don't have any other option. We really do that. Like, these are definitely many households who will not have another place to live outside of this thing. We are offering home ownership to people who would not be able to buy a home outside of it. And so I think that in many ways there are a lot of criticisms of Hope 6, but I do think there are some gains, but I think that those gains are incompatible to what we said we were striving for, and that's why we don't talk about them, right? Like, we're not talking about just providing safe, decent housing, period, is a goal, and saying, yeah, let's say we did that. We're not talking about, okay, let's offer home ownership to a segment of the population that didn't access it before. That wasn't the goal.
In a wide variety of neighborhoods.
Yes.
Slightly higher income people and forcing them into a situation that is,
Yes.
not necessarily great for them.
And the thing about, so much of this is coming from William, the truly disadvantaged, this rhetoric from Wilson about, that the real issue about ghetto neighborhoods was the exit of the middle class. But most people, we never stop to say, well, what did that mean? Like, was he proffering this argument that we had people making $100,000 living with people making $5,000? Right, because even in his work, he doesn't necessarily define what he means when he says that the middle class just walked away. And even in this country, right, we live in a country where 50% of Americans think that they're middle class, right? And so a lot of this is, again, these worlds that we just really haven't complicated enough, I think, to know how to really evaluate the policy outcomes.
Can I ask you a related question? Because Tim's question is similar to one of the things that I wanted to ask about. And it's more just a comment. The politics of the affordable housing label seems to me have kind of shifted. And your earlier point about there's sort of this very low level that just really needs decent housing, and they just need a place to live. Because and I think Berkeley may have some of this stuff, but when I was in Hawaii, I was the subject of affordable housing, right? So the governor was trying to build workforce housing, is what they called it, and they were targeting people in my income band as a tenured professor at a university. So that's not to say that there weren't a whole lot of people like that really needed affordable housing in that context, but it was nowhere near the challenge of the people living on the beach.
Yeah.
right? And fortunately, it's good weather. Again, back to the weather.
And it's really squeezing them out.
Yeah. Right.
Even in Charlotte, like this, this is workforce housing. What it means is that when we emphasize that demographic for tenancy here, then we really aren't leaving any room for the mother who's on welfare, or the mother with 4 kids, or the disabled woman on SSI, right? We're saying that they're no longer deserving of housing. And I think that that's really problematic, because at least even at its worst in the 80s and 90s, we were still serving the hardest to house in this country. We were really providing housing of last resort. And now, because of these shifts, we're no longer willing as a nation to say that that's who we're housing. And so I really question then what's going to happen to this demographic that I argue is going to stay exactly the same size or forever, or actually keep getting bigger and bigger, but we're no longer building any housing for them at all in most cities. And I don't think that we're going to go back to ever seeing public housing as we knew it in the 40s and 50s and 60s. Like, we're not going to ever build a development at the size or scale or serving the same amount of the population. And I think we're going to have some serious problems on our hands in the next 25 years because of it.
Let me ask one other question, because I also had another comment. Because one of the arguments about, whether it's white flight or middle class flight, you talked about security, and that's a big one. The other big one is schools. And I know that the demographics, at least of the home ownership group, was no kids, right? I mean, it was largely no kids. But I'm wondering, just sort of a scan look at Hope 6 and these kinds of mixed income efforts. One of the rationales is that you're going to have those kids in the same school and thereby elevate the attention paid to those schools, the funding of those schools. And it seems like that's been the case with the security aspect. Is your sense that it also goes for the schools aspect, or are they in different schools?
I think that that's the disconnect. I think that if we cared about schools, then we should maybe do models where it's like 70% home ownership and 30% rental. I think that if we're going to spend the same amount of money but on different stuff, if we did more home ownership, you would get more property tax variation that could maybe offer more money to the schools, and more, and more people invested in sending their kids to school because they're paying property taxes. So because you have that cleavage where the renters are the ones not invested, right? They're not paying the taxes. And then the homeowners are, but their kids aren't going to the schools. I still feel like it leaves a gap in the attention on the schools, because the homeowners care about a lot of stuff. They care about policing. They care about what the neighborhood looks like, the neighborhood's reputation. They care about who's going to be the next council person representing them. But they weren't talking to me about schools at all because it wasn't on their radar. They didn't care. So there's a school that's a street away. There's a neighborhood school, but the woman, Dominique, who's the only homeowner with small children, and Carla, who has a small child, they don't send their kids to that neighborhood school. So Dominic has a daughter and 2 nieces or nephews that she cares for, and they all go to private school. And Carla's son goes to a magnet school that's for science and math. So none of the homeowners were talking about education, and like making education better in the neighborhood.
I would ask, like, you mentioned crime, that it was just a perception that it went up. So you're saying that in those areas that you studied, the crime rate didn't actually go up, just the perception?
Just the perception. Because if you look at the data from the 90s, there were like drugs, prostitution, like real crime, murders, shootings. You're not seeing any violent crime necessarily on the radar in any of the police statistics. And then, like I said, you ask everyone, and oh, so-and-so took a plant off of my porch, and now I bolt down my plants. Or someone told a story about kids breaking tree limbs. So you saw some of the examples they gave of crime. No one said, oh, so-and-so got shot yesterday. Like, there's no narratives of violent crime at all. I would say maybe some petty theft and problematic kids running around, but nothing other than that.
But what about things like vice? I guess those wouldn't be, things that we label
That don't get
vice.
Reported, yeah.
Those were the things they were reporting, or were they?
So the kids talk about fighting, but what the kids say, so I don't have as many kids in my sample. The kids talk a little bit about turf wars, that, what happens is that when you break up these neighborhoods and you have a bunch of people coming in from different parts of town, it mixes up some of the social peace as far as like gang activity and things of that nature. But people say that folks in gangs don't live in the neighborhood. It's just that some of the drug sales and stuff still happen on the periphery of the neighborhood. And so the kids talk about fighting and tension, but the way he describes it, the student that I'm thinking of, is he said that at the same time it doesn't have grave consequences, that like you can have a fight, but you're not going to get shot for it, and that even when the kids have tension in the neighborhoods, that it's not long term, that they're able to kind of make amends and be fine. The other issue as well related to this, that I see as a gap as well in the literature, is that I'm not criticizing the homeowners for not wanting to care about the renters, right? So if we think about Putnam's bowling alone, it's supposed to be the benefit of being affluent to have autonomy, right? So when we're talking about good neighborhoods, white neighborhoods, affluent neighborhoods, we don't have these same notions that we have about kind of the 1960s ethnic communities about networks and borrowing sugar from your neighbor and relying on each other and watching each other's kids. We don't necessarily attribute those traits to affluent neighborhoods. So if we're producing more sustainable, affordable, mixed income communities, maybe we should actually anticipate more autonomy, right? No one stopped to say that, but because we didn't think about the race part, right? When we think of Black and Hispanic and Latino, like when we think of these neighborhoods, we think of these notions about people helping each other survive. But we don't talk about those things when we talk about white neighborhoods. There's some talk of it when we talk about ethnic white neighborhoods in New York in the 30s and 40s, but contemporary work, we don't say, like, let's go to suburbia and see how well people are relying on each other. And so that's the other thing, is I think that the homeowners are doing what you're supposed to do when you perform class, and that's keep your business and protect your assets and strive for economic security, and to distance yourself from the non-American, poor, lazy, welfare-ridden, whatever stereotype, right? But I think that we're not really able to have the language to examine and explain that because we weren't willing to say, hey, well, they're not white, so shouldn't they be relying on each other because they're not white, right? And so again, I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but I just think that there are many ways that a lot of what's driving how everything is put in operation are kind of these really unspoken conversations that many practitioners and policymakers are having in their heads, I think.
When the Hope 6 legislation was being created, in theory, and probably only in theory, I mean, they could have mandated one-to-one replacement, no loss of public housing units. Could you talk a little bit about the politics of that, why that didn't happen? Because that's a big criticism, is the loss of public housing units.
I think it's the poverty concentration rhetoric that really bulked it up. And so I think that it's the difference between these developments where we're talking 200, 300, 400 units and some of the larger developments like the Lafitte in New Orleans that had over 1,000 units, right? And so people were really, really concerned about putting all this money into something that's going to be a ghetto in another 5 years, right? You hear Rosalind. So Rosalind lived in public housing and is now a homeowner. She used her Section 8 voucher to access the homeownership program. And you hear her saying, oh, well, it's not bad yet. Like everyone's kind of saying, let's just wait on it. And this is going to be the ghetto again in a few years. And so I think that a lot of the issue with one-for-one replacement, it came from this concern about, well, if we tear down 1,000 units, but then we have to build back 3,000 in order to serve 1,000 people. They said, well, how are we fixing anything if it's the same amount of poor people in this census tract? And again, I don't think that there was any evidence or proof of it, but I think because of how we think about the pathology of, the cultural pathology of poverty stuff, that's why we started doing it. And there were some loopholes about scatter site housing that I'm going to do one-for-one replacement, but I'm going to put 100 units over here and 200 over there. And then I think that because of all those modifications being made over time, we just lost it altogether as a rule.
In the end, what were the numbers on that as far as demolished public housing units and replaced? How bad was it in terms of the loss?
I don't remember the number off the top of my head. Like, I don't know the most recent number, but around 2013, I would say that we had lost, I think I saw numbers. So Ed Getz writes about where have all the towers gone, and he estimates in some cases that, we've lost anywhere from 30 to 60% of our stock overall. But I think it also gets complicated if we were to count the Section 8 vouchers along with the ACC units. And then, not to talk in too many technical terms, but then also if you start adding in the low-income housing tax credit units, right? So our public housing pool is a lot broader because there are more programs than I'm actually talking about here. And so in many cases, maybe tearing down public housing meant that you got more housing choice vouchers, or maybe you had a mixed income model where there are a lot of tax credits mixed with ACC units. So it depends on how you count, but overall, we lost a lot of our housing stock, a lot of our permanent public housing stock. And in some cities like Atlanta, they've lost more than 75% of it. Uh-huh.
Just wondering, does that take into account like the people that have been able to live themselves up? 'Cause
I didn't hear the second part.
that
The amount of people.
the amount of people that have been able to lift themselves up into higher social brackets. Like I've known a few people in Greenville that were born into lower income housing, perhaps government housing, but have lifted themselves up to be able to afford their own house and their own rents.
So what's the question?
So I mean, does that take into account? I mean, you lowered the amount of units, but you had to take into account like the amount of people that have been able to get out.
So I feel like for the Hope 6 data, it's really hard to see because there's so much attrition in the data set. So in the very beginning, one of the big problems is that if I tear down this housing development in 2003, but I don't get it back online until 2006 or 2007, there's this serious lag, right? And so some of the Hope 6 projects, one of the biggest issues is that because of administrative, bureaucratic failure, financial crisis, whatever, funding issues, that a lot of them took a lot longer than they were expected to get back online. Some people argue that that was collusion and that it was on purpose and that they knew they would lose people by doing that because, you know, people settle somewhere else and they don't want to move back into the community. So it's harder for me to know the difference between attrition, like pure, like this person, I don't know how to get in touch with them anymore, as opposed to like they're doing better off and they no longer need it. And so in that regard, I don't know how to see that in the data just yet, beyond like trying to do more qualitative research. And so in my study, I talked to some residents who lived in this neighborhood that don't live in the Hope 6, but it's really hard to track them down to find out why they are no longer in the public housing administrative pool. But I think it's a really important question, and there are many people who are very, very concerned with the nature of displacement. And so it would be a really good research project in its own right, I think. Yeah. Any other questions?
I have one last question, because I think you're working on a book manuscript, and can you say a little bit about how you see that as the contribution to the literature, and I mean, it's obviously going to be based on some of the things you're empirically working on here, but maybe say a little bit more about how you see that book.
Okay, so again, I'll be pretty honest again. So the issue with this project is that everything that's interesting about it is everything that I didn't anticipate writing about. So the hardest thing was actually writing my dissertation, because all of the lit review, everything that I thought that I had become an expert on, none of it helped to understand any of this. I don't necessarily consider myself a race scholar. I don't necessarily consider myself like a sociologist, but a lot of my findings have like these anthropological and sociological issues that they're addressing. And so that's where I'm kind of struggling a bit with my book manuscript, because I could write a very simple book that just simply talks about Hope 6, Durham, gives the history of this neighborhood. I could write about, you know, what the neighborhood looked like, how the public housing got there, what led them to the Hope 6, what it looks like now, what I think the implications are, and really kind of have this ethnographic narrative of a community, like a case study of Durham, North Carolina. But that's not really the stuff that I find to be most compelling, right? When we talk about advancing the literature really means talking about these themes that I can't explain, right? So one of the things that's really interesting to me is that we live in a country where we consume housing. Housing is something we consume. It's just a commodity, it's a good. But at the same time, in this country, housing is so tied to notions of citizenship, right? And so part of the issue with public housing tenants is that they're bad citizens. You can drive by these neighborhoods and it models to you what it means to be a bad citizen. They don't own homes, they're not paying taxes, they're taking government handouts, they're not really kind of ascribing to the American dream, they're undereducated. There's all these flaws that are incompatible with American values that we then model through the way they're consuming their housing. And I think that that's a really important narrative to talk about, that's going to be really relevant to providing affordable housing, because if that's true and if that's how we perform as a society, maybe we really do need to be providing more access to home ownership that varies, you know, and caters to different socioeconomic levels in this country, as opposed to kind of proffering a rental society if we really believe as a society that rental housing should only be temporary. And that's the real issue here. The only reason we need this policy at all is that we think that there's a failure in renting long term. Many societies, many countries don't have that issue. And so if we didn't think that renting was a problem, we wouldn't have to spend all this money fixing our rental housing. We would just simply build more of it, and that would be it. And we have enough money to do that, and we would serve a lot of people. And so I think that that's just the conundrum where I am, is figuring out, do you write, and you guys will probably figure this out in some of your own work, is do you do what's really easy and what's in front of you, or do you try to challenge yourself to actually make a bigger contribution? And I need to figure that out, because it's, you know, it's
the second option.
but it is easy to be easy, you know. But I find this to be really interesting. What I'm more interested in doing is kind of like, you know, when you say Berkeley, is I think that it would be really important to kind of do a more comparative analysis. I think that it's really great to get the depth of this one case, but I really would like to kind of see if I'm seeing these same themes in other places. Anecdotally, from like just some of my travels, I feel like I see the same themes in other places, but I don't have this level of detail in the data. So I think that if I could look at another city or two and find the same things, then I could see a book manuscript that still is like more Hope 60, but it is a case study, you know, 3 or 4 case study model. But I just think that it's just it's a world of interesting stuff. The other side of this too is like just talking to practitioners. You know, if you talk to the real estate developers, then you get a whole nother world of how this works. It is incredibly difficult to get these projects off the ground. Getting the financing and making these projects work from a fiscal perspective, it's like magic. It is the hardest thing in the world to get these projects funded, to get them built, and to get them lived in. And so when you talk to real estate developers, you see all the social good they're providing. They're doing the work that the government won't do to get these projects actually on the ground. And so again, I think that there's lots of work and lots of themes that could be addressed from this study, even if you're looking at Louisville, Kentucky, to Berkeley, to Cambridge, Massachusetts. You're seeing this shift in affordable housing all over the U.S. You're seeing it in Thailand and Taiwan and Paris and the Netherlands, right? This is Singapore. This is also a global phenomenon as well. It's this question of how do you adequately house the poor and who's most deserving of housing in general.
Well, great. I know that you're very tired from having woken up very early, and we're very cold and very appreciative of your perspective. So why don't we give
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. We'll have another speaker, I think March 12th is the next time.